9 to 5 in a job that we hate, molding our minds to serve food on a plate, wasting our time asking who's to blame. Rush pain claims this is not what we came to. The city that says my mom would always say you are what you make, but the money I made as a bedway slave with my own bathtub babe. It's a shot to the grave, a tombstone that says what a beautiful waste of what could have been.
Tonight we're joined by a radical historian, curator of the Emma Goldman Papers Project at UC Berkeley, also someone involved in the Kate Sharpley Library Project, and contributor to many, many books, including Chomsky on Anarchism and Paul Averick's Anarchist Voices. Barry Pateman joins us tonight. And are you with us now, Barry?
I believe I am, yes.
I heard you when we were in the chat room a second ago, and it sounds like we weren't making contact, so just making sure you're there.
It's a common problem amongst anarchists.
Yeah, this is very true. Well, how's everything going tonight, Barry?
So far, so good, yeah. It's okay. I'm looking forward to taking part in your show.
What do you see any drastic differences between the anarchist scene in North America and what you were used to in the UK or in Europe in general?
I think obviously in the UK, although again one has to be careful of speaking of generalities. There's always tendencies. There's always different people who sincerely hold beliefs within anarchism that are different from mine.
Sure.
I still think that the idea of class culture and class struggle is probably still more central in England and maybe in Europe than it is here. And that's always been a big problem for me, that I cannot understand why it isn't here. But that's certainly a real difference. Another difference, I think, is that I was involved in certain feuds in the anarchist movement, of which I'm not proud of now. But I think that the level of invective directed towards other anarchists in America is slightly more malignant and poisonous than it was in England. That said, we could be pretty malignant and poisonous, but there's almost something gleeful at times about the American situation, which I find worrisome and bothersome.
When you were referring to the feuds, are you referring to the kind of the Black Flag versus the Freedom newspaper?
My solicitor will release a statement at a later date. Yes, I am. I am. I mean, they were things that I was part of. I don't think I feel proud of them particularly, though at the time I felt that what was going on was, from my point of view, absolutely right. The anarchist movement was not welcoming to working class people. It didn't really know what to do with them. I felt that there was a clear line that was drawn between militant liberalism, which I identified with Freedom at that time, and I should stop now and say I think that at the moment Freedom is a really very, very good newspaper. The editorial groups who are bringing it out probably for the last 5 or 6 years. It's a really good paper.
And for
I thought that it was militant liberalism rather than anarchism, and led to a sort of intellectual stasis. You know, it just didn't seem to be going anywhere. And I thought that because we were young and arrogant and militant, that we were. And we admired and worked very closely with people like Albert Meltzer and Stuart Christie. And I thought that they were, like Miguel Garcia and others, exemplary comrades, people I've been proud all my life to know and be friends with. And they did marvelous things, and I'd like to think that, you know, they've influenced me. They began the anarchist Black Cross and took part in fierce debates about what anarchism was and what it could mean to working class people, to people who weren't coming from middle class backgrounds, even if they were rejecting it. These were people who had come from poverty, who'd come into a world that they were trying to make sense of. And anarchism should have been a warm, welcoming home for them, but it wasn't. So, yeah, I took part in that stuff. If people really want to read it, and you really don't, Look at Freedom and Black Flag from the 80s and the 70s. There is, I should also say, I think, a really very good piece of writing called Liars and Liberals. And out of all that sort of poison, and I want to say, Lord, it didn't make me feel good afterwards thinking about it in the last 5 or 6 years. I think did come one positive thing for me, which was, in a sense, an awareness of the importance of history and the importance of the history of anarchist practice, which I'd rather been very blasé about, I think.
You mentioned Miguel Garcia, who I believe he was involved. He was actually involved in the Spanish Civil War, correct?
Oh yeah. Miguel. Yeah. Miguel had his father had been a bodyguard for Sugar Boy Salvador Segui, the CNT leader who was gunned down. As Miguel said, his dad was a very good bodyguard, and Miguel had taken part in some of the struggles in Spain. And after the revolution ended and we were defeated, Miguel joined the resistance and joined a group called the Talion Group, Scorpion, the Talion Group. He was a forger, Miguel, and he knew people like Sabate, and he knew, people now who are rather legendary names. And Miguel had actually been trained by British intelligence to make passports, because the Spanish anarchists were helping those British airmen who'd been shot down escape into Spain away from occupied France. And so he took those skills then, after 45, to help the anarchists coming in across the Pyrenees, giving them false identity papers. And the gang was rounded up. I think there was a traitor. And Miguel was actually sentenced to death.
Right.
And he sort of, the night before he was to be executed, he could hear the cell doors going, and 2 or 3 of his comrades were taken out and shot, and he was reprieved. He was given life imprisonment. So when we actually, we worked very hard, Stuart especially, to get Miguel out of prison. He had sort of the early stages of TB, and he came across to England and was really instrumental in building up and forging the anarchist Black Cross.
And Stuart Christie, I've heard you mention he's someone that you've been drawn to as a writer.
Yeah.
His story also, his story is pretty amazing too.
Yeah.
Documented in My Granny, Maybe an Anarchist.
Yeah.
His story is pretty amazing. Tell the listeners just a little bit about Stuart Christie and his story.
Oh, he's fucking demented, Stuart. He's a lovely man. He really was. He is. Stuart, the long story short, now I would urge you to anybody who hasn't read it, and if you think it's a bit peripheral, or you think it's not really, mainstream enough for you, do read My Granny Made Me an Anarchist. Just read it, and then the trilogy, Edward Heath Made Me a Terrorist, etc. They're beautifully written. They're very funny. They're actually quite humble, and they tell me of a young working class lad who, from Scottish coal mining area, who decides to go and assassinate Franco. And he has made contact at this time with the underground Spanish youth, the anarchist FIJL, and he goes into Spain with his kilt on as a tourist, to kill Franco. Of course, he'd been betrayed. There'd been a traitor in the group. And by the way, they found out who that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And he was sentenced to a long, long time in prison, and eventually was released. And it was when Stuart was in prison, and you probably know, or hope your readers, listeners, whatever you are, that in those days the anarchists had their own wing of the prisons, if there was enough of them. And the Communist Party had another section. And the only time they met was when they played football and beat crap out of each other. But so Stuart met a lot of anarchists in prison, or knew of people like Luis Ido and Miguel and everyone. And when he came back, he was really, really insistent on saying, look, these other groups are getting, their prisoners are getting money, they're getting food, they're getting clothes, they're getting books, and our prisoners often aren't. Our prisoners are being left there because we're not strong inside, we don't have wealthy supporters. We've got to really get food and provision to them. And that's really the genesis of the anarchist Black Cross.
Right. Talk briefly about the Black Cross, the anarchist Black Cross, for listeners who are not familiar with it.
Well, the anarchist Black Cross was set up really, I think, through Stuart and Albert Meltzer, and then Miguel Garcia came. The idea was, as I said, quite simply, to get support to anarchist prisoners. Now, inherent in that was a belief in, the lack of criminality anywhere. Everyone knew around the early Black Cross that the prisons were full of working-class men and women. And even if they weren't anarchists, they were worthy of support to show, if you like, the bankruptcy of prison life and its targeting certain classes and races. But realistically, all we could do was offer support to our comrades who were getting none. And so the idea spread rapidly. Initially, it was simply sending warm clothes to help prisoners in winter. It's bloody freezing in Carabanchel and some of those other prisons. They got warm clothes, they got food, they got books. And then it spread out. It became more and more of a challenge to the state. Anarchists were being imprisoned throughout Europe, by the 70s, and including comrades in Germany who were members of the Black Cross who were shot dead by the police. And you all know, the accidental death of an anarchist. Pinelli, who was thrown out of police headquarters as a railwayman, was secretary of the Black Cross over there. The Black Cross became a challenge to the state in some way that I think we never realized it would be, and became targets for all sorts of ill treatment and murder, frankly. And one has to be careful about using pejorative terms, but certainly some good comrades were shot dead, and some comrades were beaten, and some comrades' families were terrorized. And out of that, of course, came the Black Cross, through a series of twisted relationships, as it is now.
9 to 5.